So, Remembrance Day, we talk about the First World War, really, right? That's where the poppies come from. But not every man went to war. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton set out to do what no one had done before. He went to cross the Antarctica from coast to coast, and his goal was to plant a flag and claim glory and add his name to the history books alongside the other great explorers of the so-called heroic age. And in no way am I suggesting that these expeditions weren't anything but dangerous and gutsy, but I do struggle with the term heroic, because these men were racing to the ends of the earth to plant these flags as extensions of empire, as colonial mentality dressed up as science. And it was the kind of adventure where powerful men send ordinary men into danger while glory gets laden on the shoulders of the few and privileged. And Shackleton wanted to be among them. He wanted to be remembered as the man who conquered Antarctica, and at this he failed utterly. His ship, the Endurance, was crushed by ice before he even reached land. And the expedition became about one thing and one thing only, getting everyone home alive. Today, we remember Shackleton not because he succeeded at his goal, but because of how he managed his failure. His rivals, Robert Falcon Scott and Roald Amundsen, actually reached the South Pole. They planted their flags. Amundsen won the race. Scott died in the attempt. But their names have faded to all but those aficionados of that age. And Shackleton's name is remembered still because when the catastrophe happened, he got everyone home. All 28 men, not a single life was lost. The expedition that began with one man's quest for personal glory became a story about collective survival. It's because it became a story about ordinary men becoming crew for each other when everything was on the line. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the story, I'll add a little context. The Endurance set sail for the Weddell Sea in the Antarctic on December 5th, 1914, but it became frozen into the ice floe by January 19th, so just a little over a month and a half later, leaving the men trapped at the mercy of the drifting floe, so they shifted to setting up camp on the ice. 7 months later, the pressure finally broke the ship's hull, and it began taking on water, and within a month, it had slipped beneath the surface, leaving the men on this floe. And for another 5 months, the men drifted until their floe broke into two, and Shackleton ordered the men into their 3 remaining lifeboats, and they rowed for 5 days until they reached Elephant Island. It was the first time they'd set foot on solid ground for 497 days. The problem with Elephant Island is that it's remote. It was far from any shipping lanes. It is inhospitable. The barren island supports no native terrestrial flora or fauna. And Shackleton knew that it was unlikely that they would be rescued, so he outfitted the strongest of these 3 remaining 20-foot lifeboats with 4 weeks of supplies, and he took 5 men with him, and they attempted to cross the open ocean to South Georgia Island, which is approximately 1,250 kilometers or 780 miles. They navigated in this little boat hurricane-force winds, and they were constantly in danger of being dashed against rocks before they finally reached the whaling station on South Georgia Island 26 days later. He immediately appealed to the Chilean government for help, and they lent him a seagoing tug called the Yelcho, which returned to Elephant Island on the 30th of August, 1916, 4.5 months after Shackleton had left them there. So Ernest Shackleton, and rightly so, has become famous for his leadership and courage in what ultimately was a failed expedition, and I am not trying to take anything away from him because he was courageous. But what often gets lost in this story, because we love a great man narrative, is how the 22 men left on Elephant Island survived. Right? They also knew how unlikely it was for them to be rescued. They knew how small Shackleton's boat was. They knew how difficult the conditions that he was sailing into were. They knew that his chance of survival, meaning their survival, was remote. And he only left them with 2 upturned lifeboats for shelter, some seal blubber for fuel, and almost no supplies. So their survival depended on everyone doing their part for the collective. Shackleton left a man called Frank Wild in charge, and he created a daily ritual. So every morning, for over 4 months, he rolled up his sleeping bag and declared to the men, "Get your things ready, boys, the boss may come today." And it wasn't optimism, it was practice. Right? This was the daily work of reorienting the collective mind from the appalling present to the vision of the future. And he established daily routines and hunting expeditions and meal schedules and a rotating system so that everyone got a turn near the stove to dry their clothes, and he managed conflict. And he enforced a fair distribution of space. And he maintained discipline. And when the men showed signs of despair, he put them to work. And on Saturdays, he ordered banjo concerts. Those who tell this story are given to saying that it was a miracle that they survived, but it was not a miracle. Right? I sometimes use the word God to express the deep spiritual interconnection of life, but there was no divine intervention that kept these men alive. The crew survived because Wild created a container within which survival was possible. They survived because they had a vision, a belief in each other, and the willingness to sacrifice personal desire for the survival of the crew. And I think this is, in part, the great question of our age. Are we willing to sacrifice personal desire for the survival of the crew? 39 years after the rescue, in 1965, at the height of the space race, which honestly still kind of baffles me that we were trying to reach the South Pole, and then 40 years later we were on the moon, right? But at the height of the space race, the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan said, "There are no passengers on spaceship Earth, we are all crew." There are no passengers on spaceship Earth, we are all crew. Humanity was beginning to see the Earth from orbit for the first time, and McLuhan understood that in an interconnected world, detachment is impossible. It is a delusion that we maintain to avoid responsibility to one another, to reject our mutual accountability, to deny our duty to each other. You know, last week for our communion service, we talked about the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. At the same time, right, in 1966, when Vietnam was escalating, he created his order of interbeing. We were talking about interbeing last week. The inter-R of our lives. And in this ferment of the time, we were being invited to reckon with ourselves as a single interconnected entity. We are still wrestling with this. McLuhan draws the same conclusion as Thai. His quote, "There are no passengers, we are all crew," is a direct refutation of the passive consumer mindset. A passenger is someone who consumes, who is served, who asks, "What's in it for me?" A crew member is someone who contributes, who serves the ship. the one who understands that their own survival is inseparable from the survival of the entire rest of the body. And one thing that I truly love about Canada, and one thing that I think that distinguishes this nation most from our sibling to the south, our alcoholic and angry sibling, which I also love. One thing that I think distinguishes us, right, is an understanding of this interconnection, that it resonates deep with a foundational chord in Canadian identity. There is a predisposition towards the collective over the rugged individual, and this isn't by accident. 2 months ago, Canadian politician and writer Charlie Angus, in an essay called "The Spirit of the Jack Pine," sought to explain the bonding that we experienced as the MAGA movement assaulted us. And he used the scrubby, defiant jack pine, bent by northern winds, surviving where the mighty oak cannot, as a symbol, as a spiritual symbol of Canadian life. The landscape has taught Canadians interdependence long before McLuhan gave it language. 6 months of snow and temperatures dropping to sometimes below 40, minus 40, creates a necessity of mutual aid. Angus writes, "Mr. Marlboro man wouldn't last long here. He wouldn't be able to push his vehicle out of a snowbank without asking someone for help." Canadians have survived because we understand that we have to rely on our neighbors. While I do believe this, I think we are seeing some of this start to fade. Late-stage capitalism, social media, the relentless propaganda of the isolated individual. There's an atomization of society, and we're seeing the rise of what we're calling the main character syndrome, where people increasingly view themselves as the protagonist of life, where everyone else is demoted to supporting characters. It's the psychological antithesis of interbeing. It is defined by a difficulty sharing the stage with others and a fundamental lack of empathy. A community of main characters demands that others go unseen and are undervalued. And every interaction is transactional, measured against the self-centered question, does this meet my needs? And it's the root of our spiritual crisis, psychological immaturity. And because churches mirror the culture more than they guide it, many churches, in a desperate attempt not to collapse under the weight of the meaninglessness that we're experiencing in society, have created an environment where members become spectators and they come to sit and get a show. And then they're prone to criticize everything that doesn't line up to their preferences, because people aren't responsible for what happens. And it's a spiritual entertainment model that mistakes consumption for faith. And it creates a passenger system. It creates what all passenger systems do. They create isolation and burnout and declining attendance and a culture where people ask, what do I get, instead of how can I contribute? And churches know there's a problem, so they implement technical fixes. New programs and better websites and strategic plans and government restructures, some of which are important, but Ronald Heifetz reminds us that the single biggest failure of leadership is to treat adaptive challenges with technical problems. If you have a broken furnace, you call a technician because that's a technical problem. But our culture is spiraling because we lost a sense of meaning, and there is no meaning technician. A technician's not going to fix it. We are all crew on Spaceship Earth. There are no passengers. Even if we are being led to believe this, we're facing an adaptive challenge. And we need to change our values and our beliefs and our roles and our relationships. And no expert can do this for us. The people with the problem must do the work of solving it. Only we can choose to become a crew. This isn't easy. Joseph Campbell reminds us that in every story, the hero always refuses the call initially. Right? The moment arrives, the challenge is there, and the hero says, no thanks. And this is important because in the story, you have to acknowledge that the fear is real, because the fear is real. Fear of the unknown. What if I can't do this? Fear of loss. What if I lose my comfort and my control? Fear of vulnerability. What if I'm inadequate? And underneath all of these fears, perhaps the deepest one, what if I give everything and it's still not enough? These are real fears, like valid fears. The thing about telling stories is that ultimately, right, the hero always pushes through their fears. And the thing about real life is that's not always true. Many people retreat into what Campbell calls the house of death because people want to build walls to stay safe. When we refuse to face the truth, we don't stay safe, we just slowly die inside those walls. Here in Canada, we are not immune to the what do I get mentality. But I think we do have some cultural resources to remind us, to guide our vision, to bolster our courage in our efforts to step away from the house of death and become crew. Charles Taylor, great Canadian philosopher, in his seminal work, Sources of the Self, writes, "To know who I am is a species of knowing where I stand. My identity is defined by the commitments and identifications which provide the frame or horizon within which I can try to determine what ought to be done." Now, there's a translation here. What he's saying is a direct refutation of the atomized passenger self. He argues that identity is not private. It's not an individual project. We are not self-made. Rather, identity is formed in relation to a collective. Which brings me to Remembrance Day. This is not a holiday. This is not a celebration. This is a covenant. This is a sacred promise that we make to each other and that we make to the ancestors, that we will not forget that we owe a collective national debt to the ordinary soldiers who sacrificed for the crew. Just last week, we shared bread together. Today, we share memory together. The bread of communion creates companions, cum panes, those who eat together. Remembrance Day creates crew, cum memoria, with memory, those who accept collective responsibility. Both rituals kind of work the same. They transform individual consumers into a collective body, a shared social body. When we eat the same bread, we become companions. When we remember the same sacrifice, we belong to the same covenant. We wear the poppy, for me anyway, not for reasons of patriotic propaganda, which can be dangerous. It can be dangerous. If you kneel during a football game because you want to talk about black men being murdered by the police, some nations will tell you that you're disrespecting the soldiers. That's dangerous propaganda, and Canada's not immune. So for me, wearing the property is not for reasons of patriotic propaganda, but to embody the sentiment, really, of Frank Wilde, who expressed this each time he rolled up his sleeping bag for those 4 months. Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today. It's the work of reorienting the collective mind from the appalling present to the vision of the future. That's what we're called to do, not wait for rescue, but to become crew together, to hold a vision, to do the daily work. Because we've got some problems to deal with. No one is going to solve our environmental problem. We have to solve it. No one is going to solve our income inequality problem, our housing problem. We just elected some politicians. We need to solve that. There is an oft-told apocryphal story about Shackleton's recruitment advertisement. The story goes that there was a small announcement published in the paper that read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in event of success." Now, this is almost certainly a myth. Right? No original has ever been found. It's first appeared in a book on advertising in 1949. But as with all powerful myths, the truth is as important. It is not as important as the factuality, right? It continues. This story continues to resonate with people. I guarantee you, if you go looking for Shackleton now, you will see this people quoting this ad, which did not happen. But it continues to resonate with people because it was consistent with the kind of leader we imagined Shackleton to be and with what we want to believe about ourselves, right? Mainly that we are not just wired for comfort, we are also wired for meaning. That part of the human spirit seeks a challenge-worthy life. There's a message in our culture, and definitely in our churches at the moment, that says something like passengers wanted, comfortable seats, entertaining music, professional services, no demands, low cost. When what we really need is something that says crew wanted for hazardous journey. Difficult conversations. High accountability, long hours of adaptive work, safe return to the way we've always done things doubtful. Collective awakening and a just world in event of success. It's okay to be afraid, but we cannot retreat into the house of death. We will just slowly perish within the walls that we think are there to keep us safe. This is the heart of the covenant that we are reminded of on Remembrance Day. Those people didn't die for something in the past. They sacrificed for something in the future. That is the debt. Lest we forget, in the Canadian context, means continuing responsibility. It means upholding values preserved through collective sacrifice. So as we remember those who understood that they were crew, the question hanging in the air is, will we honor their understanding by becoming crew ourselves? Last week, through communion, we became companions. We shared bread together. Today, we are called to become crew, companions who accept mutual responsibility. The difference is, companions might still be passengers eating together. Crew are companions who show up not because they'll get something, but because others depend on us. Crew make themselves vulnerable because trust requires it. Crew hold a vision on days when others can't. We do this not just for our church. We don't even do this for our nation. We do this for our earth. Because none of us are passengers. We can't survive as passengers. We all share the same fate. We are all crew. Let us say yes to this hazardous journey together. Amen.